In electronic music, drums are the most important part of a track. Almost every hit song these days has the best sounding drums. If you want to make your track loud and compete with commercial producers, then the very first thing you need to do is to make your drums loud. And then we can move on to care about the rest of the elements of a mix like basses and tonals. 80 to 90% of the loudness comes from two things only. And in the decreasing order of the loudness of an electronic music track, these are drums and basses. Drums are the anchor point of a mix. Other elements of the track balance with the level of drums. In electronic music, drums and basses must be louder than other elements of the track. So now that you know why drums are so important in electronic music, it is super important to know what mindset an electronic producer should have for producing drums and how to make them sound the best. Let's start by talking about a real life drum set. Drum set. The most common drum set is a 5-piece, and these are bass drum, which is also called kick at the center, rack tom 1 about 10% left, rack tom 2 about 10% right, snare drum about 15 to 20% left, floor tom about 15 to 20% right, hi-hat cymbal about 50% left, crash cymbal about 25 to 30% left, and right cymbal about 30 to 40% right. This is like the minimum requirement for making a drum set. Various other additions can be done, depending on the type of track you want to make. Pan and level drums according to a real life drum set. It means the opposite of all these pan positions should be programmed in your DAW. As when we would listen to a real drummer, the sounds would come from the opposite side because as an audience we would always face the performer. Many electronic genres require the snare to be panned at the center, as the energy of the snare is needed to match to that of the kick to some degree. If you want to make your drums sound realistic, nothing else should be at the center, other than these two elements. Do not hesitate to hard pan the drum elements. Kick drum. In electronic music, the single most important sound in a track which defines the tonality, energy, mood and expression of the whole track is the kick. The kick is the only sound in the drums that can have all the frequencies of the spectrum. This is generally the loudest element of a track. In many cases, the basses would also match the loudness with your kick. Though it is not important to tune the kick with the project key, it sometimes helps the kick to add more character to your track. A sense of more cohesiveness gets established if you tune the kick with the project key. Sometimes you would find yourself using a kick which is not in tune with the project key but still sounds great. Select a kick which has a very short release. Think of a kick as just a transient. Boomy kicks don't give much space for the basses and sound horrible on club sound systems. If you like a kick but the release is too long, make a gain fade or apply a volume fade at the end of the kick and make it short about 1/16th of a note. Layering a kick can make it cut through the mix beautifully. For making the top end of your kick, use another kick which has a good presence and click and mix it with the original. In some cases, you would layer 3 kicks together for each band of low, mid and high. We can also use Foley samples for layering as well. Follies are nothing but sound recordings of everyday life used in post-production of films. Blend the layers of the kick using low shelf EQing. We can go creative and layer a closed hi-hat with a short transient for the high-end frequencies of the kick for that extra click and tightness. Don't use very steep cuts while EQing as the new made kick would then sound unnatural. Use a saturator or a multiband compressor for gluing the layers and saturation of the new made kick. Plugins like G-Clip, Crush, OTT, Barrier, Camel Crusher, Blackbox Analog Designer G2, etc. help in the process. Some people use synthesizers, Foley samples, or simply record audio to make kick. It solely depends on the ability of the producer to shape the sound in the desired manner by using DAW and plugins. Don't use high-pass filter on kick to cut the low end, as it would alter the phase and pitch of the kick. Instead, use low shelf EQing if you want to cut the low end around 20 to 45 Hz. A golden rule of thumb is that never play any other element of your track when the kick is being played. Sidechaining is useful here. There are a few ways to do that. Use compressor with a ratio of more than 20:1 as it starts acting as a limiter, and then use the sidechain function in the compressor. We can use the sidechain plugin like STFU. Or we can simply use volume automations, which is a more traditional approach to achieve sidechaining. Use an oscilloscope like Wave Observer from PressPlay to check whether sidechaining is done properly or not. Important frequency areas in a kick to be taken care of. 20 to 30 Hz is the subsonic range. 40 to 45 Hz is the rumble of the kick. 50 to 100 Hz for power. Too much amplitude here causes boominess. 100 to 250 Hz for fatness. Too much amplitude here causes muddiness. 400 to 800 Hz, too much amplitude here causes boxiness. 700 to 750 Hz for knock. 1 to 3 kHz for presence. 3 to 5 kHz for snap, attack and beat noise. Too much amplitude here makes the kick sound harsh. 5 to 8 kHz for click and crack. 8 to 20 kHz for sheen or air. Snare drum. The second most important sound in the drums is the snare drum. The snare is usually kept in tune with the project key, but there are no strict rules for this. The pitch of a snare in a real drum set varies whenever played by a drummer, and so this should be taken care of while programming a snare in your DAW, or while synthesizing snare from a synthesizer. It means that there are very slight variations in the pitch of the snare from the attack till the release of the snare. It is impossible for a snare sound to be perfectly in a single note for the whole duration of its sample. There are very slight variations in the pan of the snare throughout the course of playing, as the drummer never hits the skin of the snare drum at one exact point always. All these phenomena happen obviously because of the power in striking, playing style, groove, and many other factors which affect the pan, pitch, envelope, and amplitude of the snare every time it is hit. Layering a snare with claps, percussions, or follies can make your snare sound more natural. When reverb is used, the tail of the reverb is there to fill in the gap between two hits. Plate reverbs are often used, but we can use any kind of reverb. Slapback delay is often used on snares, and for more natural sounding delay, setting the delay time by ear really helps to make the snare sound more organic. Important frequency areas in a snare to be taken care of. 100 to 250 Hz for fatness and fullness. Too much amplitude here causes muddiness. 400 to 1 kHz. This is where the fundamental frequency lies. Too much amplitude here causes boxiness. 3 to 5 kHz for snap and attack. Too much amplitude here causes harshness and masks the vocals or instruments. Around 10 kHz for air and brightness. Too much amplitude here causes the snare to sound shrill. Tom drum. Number of toms vary from 2 to any number depending on how many tones you need. There is no fixed ratio of rack and floor toms. Toms are generally tuned to the project key as they are usually done in real life by a drummer. Important frequency areas in toms to be taken care of. 65 to 100 Hz for power to floor toms. Too much amplitude here causes boominess. 100 to 200 Hz for power to rack toms. Too much amplitude here causes muddiness. 400 to 800 Hz. Too much amplitude here causes boxiness. 5 to 7 kHz for snap and attack. Too much amplitude here makes them sound harsh. Hi-hat. There is only one hi-hat which is opened and closed using a clutch and is even struck using drumsticks. Therefore, we should always select sounds or design sounds for hi-hats, keeping this basic thing in mind. Important frequency areas in a hi-hat cymbal to be taken care of: 300 to 500 Hz for weight, 2 to 3 kHz for presence. Too much amplitude here can cause shrillness. 10 to 15 kHz for crispiness. Crash. Important frequency areas in a crash cymbal to be taken care of: 400 to 500 Hz for weight, 10 to 12 kHz for sheen, about 12 kHz for air. Ride. Important frequency areas in a ride cymbal to be taken care of: 300 to 600 Hz for ring, 4 to 6 kHz for sheen, about 12 kHz for air. General important frequency areas for cymbals are 200 to 500 Hz for thickness to cymbals. Too much amplitude here can cause muddiness or boxiness. 3 to 5 kHz for presence. Too much amplitude here makes them sound harsh and masks the vocals. 7 to 12 kHz for sheen. Too much amplitude here makes it sound shrill and piercing. About 12 kHz for air. Percussions. The oldest form of instrumental music is percussion. Form of music older than percussion is the voice or vocalization. Percussions also play an important role in shaping the tonality, mood, expression, and energy of the track. There are absolutely no rules when it comes to selecting or designing sounds for percussions. Percussion elements can occupy any part of the frequency spectrum. It is just that the purpose of the element in the mix and arrangement should be carefully thought beforehand. Percussions should not overpower any other important part of the track like kick, snare, basses, lead, vocals, etc. In percussion, the idea of tuning to a note is uncommon. Whatever sounds good and cohesive with other parts of the track is fit to be used. Drums arrangement. Consider having a mindset of arranging drums as if you yourself are a drummer playing drums. For more idea, watch how drummers play their drums. Even though you are producing electronic music, you should keep this in mind that drums are a real-life instrument and should be treated like that in the areas of composition and arrangement. It should be composed and arranged in a way that it is humanly possible to play in the way you have programmed in your DAW. For example, you should not write a snare, a tom, and a crash at the same time, simply because a drummer does not have more than two hands. You should program drums as if one person played it. Though if you are going for a cinematic, orchestral, anthem, etc. type vibe for your track, then it is common to have a soundscape which consists of more than one drum set, a set of percussions, or have a whole orchestra. In electronic music, the more you humanize your composition, arrangement, and style of playing, the more relatable your track becomes for the listener. You can become creative and use cinematic drums and percussions as well for an electronic track. The only thing you should care about is that how much energy you want to keep with respect to the main element of the track, which is the bass drum or kick. Compression. Compression reduces the overall dynamic range of an audio material by detecting when it exceeds a certain level and then attenuating it by a certain amount. Simply put, the difference between the loudest and softest part of a track is reduced so that the level is more even. Automating the volume of a track is also compression. Bringing down the loud parts is downward compression and bringing up the soft parts is upward compression. This process is automated by a compressor, and it also colors the sound in a unique way. Compression can cause distortion when the attack and release are very fast, or the threshold is very low, or the ratio is very high. Different type of compressors work very differently on specific numbers. Like 10 milliseconds may be a slow attack for a VCA compressor, but fast for a FET compressor, and so on. All compressor types have different types of attack and release response. In electronic music, use of bus compression and parallel compression is very common. Using compression on individual tracks and using bus compression or parallel compression will of course have a huge difference. There are three main techniques to use compression: glue compression or bus compression, parallel compression, and serial compression. Glue compression or bus compression. Glue compression is basically applying compression to the output of an entire submix to make all elements bind together and sound as a part of each other. By applying glue compression to our drum bus, we are able to subtly provide drums with a cohesive sense of space. Glue compression can also result in drums with more punch and clarity. This technique attenuates the tail end of the transients of the drums. SSL bus compressors are exceptionally musical, which gives them an edge over digital compressors that apply gain reduction in a linear fashion. But glue compression can be done using any digital compressor you have. Just keep a long attack, medium release, ratio 2:1 or 3:1, and aim for a gain reduction of not more than 3 dBs. Multiband compressors like OTT also help in glue compression. Parallel compression. Parallel compression is basically mixing heavily compressed version of the duplicate audio material with the original. It can be achieved by using chains, using the dry wet knob of the compressor, sends or returns, or by simply duplicating tracks. Parallel compression can make our drums have more impact. This technique involves mixing our original drums with a heavily compressed duplicate drum signal. The compressed signal fills in the dips in the amplitude of the original signal, thereby making the dynamic range smaller, which makes the drum sound bigger and thicker. Always remember to match the output level to the input level in the compressor of the aux return track and then blend it with the original signal. New York style compression drum trick brings up the noise flow and also the reverb tails. This type of compression is not good for all types of sounds. It makes the end result sound very harsh if you are using clip to zero method, so be careful while using it. If you want to use it for a very little amount only, as on high amounts it would start causing excessive distortion. It can make the drums sound extremely dirty and distorted. To use the NYC drum trick, put an aux send on the drums submix or drum track whichever you are working with. Make another track for aux return or use a bus whichever method your DAW allows you. Add a compressor to this track or to your bus. Set a high ratio of 8:1 or 12:1 or more. Set a very fast attack and a medium slow release. Set the threshold so as to have a 10 dB of gain reduction. Use makeup gain to compensate, or if your compressor does not have a makeup gain feature, then match the input and output level manually. Put an EQ just after the compressor. Put a low shelf around 100Hz with a boost of around 3 dBs. Add a high shelf around 10 kHz with a boost of around 3 dBs. Blend in the original drum track or submix with the bus, but remember not to overdo it to avoid harshness. Parallel compression and NYC were basically the same thing in the past, but now parallel compression has its own thing, more likely to be used with the taste and preferences of the producers. We can use a multiband compressor as well in parallel processing. Multiband compressors like OTT and TDR Nova are two best free multiband compressors. OTT is a multiband upward and downward compressor, which is like a staple plugin for most electronic music producers. Serial compression. Serial compression uses more than one compressor in the signal chain, where the first compressor feeds its output to the second compressor. In this way, the compression ends up being more transparent than if you use only one compressor and make it work too hard. Important things to remember while using serial compression is that a faster compressor is generally used before a slower compressor. A high ratio compressor is generally used before a lower ratio compressor. By using a faster, more aggressive compressor, some of the transients will be shaved off, resulting in a more consistent hit. The smoother sound is then fed into the slower compressor, where we can get back some of the initial attack. Distortion, saturation, clipping, and limiting. Any alteration in the shape of the original audio signal is called distortion. There are plenty of plugins out there to create distortion. Saturation is a type of audio distortion caused by overloading or technically saturating the physical components of an analog gear. Passing signals through tapes, tubes, or transformers makes the audio sound fuller and better because saturation introduces two new processes to the original signal: compression and harmonic generation. Tape, tube, and transistor saturation are the three main forms of saturation. Plugins like M-Saturator, Crush, Camel Crusher, OTT, Burrier help in the saturation process. Use of distressors is very common in the analog world. There is a free plugin as well for this, like MJUC Junior. For tape saturation, use Ferric TDS MK2. For tube saturation, use Blackbox Analog Design HG2 or GSAT Plus. All these plugins which I have mentioned should be used especially in a submix other than being used on individual tracks. Clipping the signal to 0 dB using a hard clipper and then gain staging is always recommended. Use G-clip to clip the signal to 0 dB. At last, add a limiter to keep drum elements not exceed 0 dB and avoid true peaks clippings. Accompany short transienty or plucky sounds in your drums as compressing, multiband compressing, distorting, saturating, clipping and limiting give best result on sounds with short transients for maximum loudness. It is important and necessary to level the drum elements after making submix of the drums, as the processes of compression, saturation, distortion, multiband compression, clipping and limiting would change the gain of all the elements of the drums. Let me show you how I use these plugins in a drums submix. So these are my go-to settings for drums. It really makes the drums sound glued, saturated, punchy and loud. Transient Shaping. Similar to a compressor, a transient shaper is also a dynamic processing tool, but there is a difference between the two. Compressors depend on threshold levels, whereas transient shapers do not. A compressor can be used to shape the curvature of a signal's transients, but it will only apply this processing consistently if each transient is of the exact same amplitude. In some cases, we have to process the punch and snap of a very dynamic recording, such as a jazz drummer's snare track or drums programmed for a cinematic genre. This is where use of a compressor becomes irrelevant, and we will have to use a transient shaper. With a transient shaper, we can apply consistent transient processing to any signal regardless of its dynamics. Using a transient shaper is simple. We just have to adjust the attack and sustain controls of a transient shaper, and we can easily change the punch and sustain of individual drum tracks or the entire drum bus. Transient shapers are sometimes the best option for your drum bus because they are independent of the threshold level and can handle complicated dynamic signals easily. Reverb. To make an illusion of space and depth to our drums, we use reverb. We require 2 reverb plugins. You may use any reverb plugins you like, or you can use the same plugin twice with different settings, which I'm about to tell you. This processing would work the best on snares, though it can also be used on toms and cymbals. The first reverb is used to fill a small space of the drums. The second reverb is used for creating sustain and a tail for the drums. Parallel processing is required to achieve these effects. For reverb 1, send the drum element first to a short reverb. Set the reverb to 100% stereo and set the decay time between 200 and 500 milliseconds. Send a lot of audio to this reverb, then turn down the reverb until you barely notice it. Too much of this effect will make the drums sound like the 90s. For reverb 2, mute the first reverb and send the element to the second reverb. Set the reverb also to 100% stereo. This reverb can be a stereo room, hall, plate or chamber. Set the decay time between 1.5 and 4 seconds with pre-delay of 10 milliseconds to 20 milliseconds. Send enough of the drum element to make this reverb loud and then turn the effect return down until you feel a long decay and keep the reverb softer than the element. Play the drums along with both the reverbs in the context of the mix. Insert a low shelf cut from 200 to 400 Hz after the second reverb and compress the output of the long reverb by 3 to 4 dB with a 20 milliseconds attack and a 50 millisecond release to enhance the character and density of the reverb. You can sidechain the reverb output with the original element for more clarity. Gated reverb. This technique is used to create drums that sound massive without your mix getting uncontrollable. Throughout the 1980s, pop, rock and funk songs all made use of this processing technique, which at the time was very well liked. Gated reverb can be recognized in the 80s songs by its artificial splat sound. It created the impression that the snare would decay slowly but got abruptly stopped. Take any reverb plugin. I am using a plate reverb for hi-hats and snare. Use parallel processing for this technique. First put an aux send to the original track you want to apply this effect. Make a separate track for aux return or use bus. Here, first put a reverb with your preferred settings, then put a gate with a very fast attack to allow initial signal to pass unaffected. Release depends on how long you want to take it for gain reduction to fully apply. Once the signal drops below the threshold level, the faster you set the release, the less natural it will sound, and the longer you set the release, the more natural it will sound. Gated reverb can be specially used for drops when those snare or hi-hats are hitting very often and we need that big feel. Delay. To give a sense of space and depth, we can also use delay. Reverbs can push the drums towards the back of the mix. But with delays, we do not have that problem, especially when we are talking about slapback delays. This technique keeps the drums dry, forward in the mix, and aggressive. A slapback delay is a delay that occurs briefly after the original signal, usually within 20 to 30 milliseconds. A feedback amount of 0 is used to prevent ringing effects because delay time is very short. Slapback delay sounds like a faint echo, which is useful for providing a sense of space or ambience to the drums. Use parallel processing for this technique. Put an aux send on the track you want to apply this effect, make a separate track for aux return, or use a bus. Here 2 delays will be used. First delay is with 0 feedback and keep the delay time around 1/64th of a note. Second delay is with 0 feedback. The delay time here is set to around 1/32nd of a note. Do not forget to keep the signal 100% wet. Now place an EQ after the delays and put a low shelf cut around 400 Hz and a high shelf cut around 12 kHz. Invert the phase of the whole signal in the aux return or the bus. Now blend it with the dry signal according to taste. There is a wide range of tones you can achieve with a slapback delay by carefully sculpting the delayed signal with EQing. By eliminating the high end, we may produce dark and gloomy emotions, or we can get bright and joyful vibes by removing the low end. Slapback delays provide liveliness to drums that can otherwise sound dead and boring. When reverb is too overwhelming, try using a slapback delay. Automation. Necessary effects to be automated are volume, gain, EQing, velocity if you are using MIDI drums. Then comes reverb, delay, saturation, and distortion. Only do very subtle pitch automation of drum elements with a clear logic before doing anything. Very subtle pan automation of cymbals. For snares, be very specific in terms of automating the pitch and pan. Keep in mind that the drum parts like snare, toms, and cymbals are intact at their place and do not move from their positions in a real drum setup. Only the area where it is struck from the drumstick changes. And of course, there is no change in the pan of the bass drum or the kick. Panning in percussions depend on the type of percussion used. For example, shakers can be played across the whole stereo field. A few traditional cymbals also have interesting change in the panning of the sound, which depends on the technique in which they are played. We should not mess with the originality of the drum elements. After all, composition and arrangement is done. The goal is to enhance them through automation and not change their tonality, that is, start sounding unnatural. Automation should be avoided on submixes and should rather be done on the individual drum elements, though there are no rules for this. Rest depends on your creativity. Quantization. Kicks are kept 100% quantized to the beat grid for beat matching in electronic music. Rest all other elements of the drums can be non-quantized. That too for a very small percentage to make drums sound more natural and authentic. There are many groove and swing settings which your DAW provides and can become handy sometimes, but I would suggest you to make changes in the timing of each drum element manually according to the different sections of the track like intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge, outro, etc. Thanks for watching the video and do share it with your fellow producer friends.